Thank you. I'm really glad to be here. And my story is really a story about failure and reinvention, which starts when I'm very young. So I'm the daughter of a scientist. I'm a science journalist, but my father was an entomologist and chemical ecologist. And I'm one of his 4 daughters, about which he was only slightly bitter. We never realized how bitter he was until my youngest sister was born, and he told everyone she was a boy named George. And for all of her life, he called her Gorgeous George, just to make up to her. But the other thing about my dad is that no matter who we were or who we wanted to be, he really wanted all of us to grow up to be scientists. All of us had to take all the math and science in high school, and he constantly was sort of hinting around about this. Other little girls got dolls for Christmas. We got chemistry sets. Other families had flowers in the middle of their dining room table. We had a tarantula. He was studying tarantulas. It was in a plexiglass box, but it was a striking table ornament. And actually, when I was at the University of Georgia as a journalism student, he brought me a tarantula as a housewarming present, which I actually had at that apartment for 3 years. And I actually was the one daughter that he thought was going to turn out a scientist. I loved chemistry. I loved it in high school. I had an amazing chemistry teacher. And so when I started in college, I started at the Florida State University as a honors science major with a specialization in chemistry. And I loved the class, absolutely loved the chemistry class. And I was such a nerd about this that there was one semester that I even embroidered all my blue jeans with atomic orbital patterns because I was so excited that particular semester about atomic orbitals. And the only problem was that then I actually had to go to a lab. And in the lab, it was a whole different story for me because I would get into the lab and I was just never one of those people who was entirely in the moment in the laboratory, which you have to be. So I would be sitting there. There was one experiment we did where we were creating crystals and they would analyze them for the impurities. And I would literally be looking at these crystals and thinking, oh, that dark one, it looks very sinister. I wonder if it's like the villain of the story. And I start making up stories about the crystals, and pretty soon my whole thing would boil over. And so in a single semester, I generated a toxic cloud and forced an evacuation of the lab. And really, I have always thought I should have married this postdoc, but one day I'm sitting there, I'm working away. I have long braids at the time, and I'm working away on some particular experiment, and Frank, I still remember his name, the postdoc comes up and he goes to me, Deborah, do you smell smoke? I looked at her, my braids are on fire in the Bunsen burner. I had not even noticed this, right? And they're like singeing away. So at that point, I went back to my dorm. I call my dad, right? I'm like, I don't think I want to be a chemistry major anymore. I was really, and I said to him, I'm just afraid that either I or someone else is going to be dead by the end of the semester. It became clear that this did not worry my father that much. He clearly felt that even if I went up with a fireball, I would have upheld the family honor by remaining a chemist. And so we had this standoff conversation. My braids are still crumbling at the ends. I'm on the phone. And he finally says to me, well, you could become a theoretical chemist. And I'm like 18 years old, with my hair barely stopped smoking. I'm like, no, I'm never going to do that. I don't want to be it. And my father was so disappointed, right? I mean, there was no, okay, go do what you want to do. It was clearly that I had failed. And that was part of it for me, but the other part of it for me is I didn't know what I wanted to be if I wasn't going to be a chemist. Everything about what I wanted to do was to become a chemist, and now I am standing there alone in this hallway with my father having almost hung up on me because he was so upset with me, thinking, I have no idea what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And so I kind of drifted through the rest of that semester until finally I thought, okay, well, I have to do something. And I also like to write. I'm the kind of person who makes up stories about crystals in the laboratory. And I like to get paid. I'm very pragmatic. And so I'll go into journalism, whatever that is, because I can be a writer and I can get paid. That's the way it works. And so I switched over to the University of Georgia, which has a very good journalism school. And I was terrible when I started. I joined the college newspaper, and when I started, there was one point where they would use the first story I ever did for the Red and Black as an example of how not to be a journalist, right? I mean, I was really bad, but the other thing I was very stubborn. And I also learned to really love sharing stories and getting behind the scenes with stories. How does something work? Journalism is always about, how does this work? Does it work correctly? Who can help me figure out how it works? And I loved that. I absolutely loved it. And also, which is probably part of my personality, I really don't like to be told no. And journalism is an exercise in getting around no. You'd be amazed at the number of people, and I know it will surprise you, who don't want to talk to journalists, right? And so your job as a journalist, because they're an central part of the story you want to tell, is to find a way to get them to tell you these things. How do you do that? There's like amazing, we have conversations about this in the profession. And I loved that puzzle. And I loved learning how to get around no's. And I liked taking stories and giving voices to people who had no voice. And letting people into worlds that they didn't see, because the one thing I learned very on as a journalist is that what you read in the paper, is always only part of the story, but that most people don't experience all these different things that you do as a journalist. So I was a journalist in the South for 5 years. I was a general assignment reporter, and then I realized, this is part 2 of where failure led me, that I did not want to rattle around cops and courts and all the beats I'd done, and I wanted to write about science, which was what I cared about. So I had learned that I could reinvent myself, and this is really about the power of learning to reinvent yourself. I had reinvented myself. I was going to be a chemist. Now I was going to be a journalist. Now I was going to be a science journalist. I got zero support from this idea, zero. My editor at the St. Petersburg Times in Florida told me that I was throwing a good career away on a fad. And my father, bless his heart, as we say in Georgia, my father was horrified, right? Because he was afraid I would interview his friends. And that was the first thing he said to me: okay, if you have to do this, you have to do this, but you can't interview any of my friends because that would be totally embarrassing. And so I quit my job before I was even in grad school. I was so sure I could make this work. I had come to believe in myself and my ability to reinvent myself, and so I cold quit my job in St. Pete, waited to get into grad school, and this will show you how confident I was at this point. I had applied to Berkeley because my boyfriend was in California. And then one of the people who wrote me a letter of recommendation said to me, well, you should apply to the University of Wisconsin, which is where he was from. And I thought, okay, maybe I'll apply to 2 schools. And so I applied to Wisconsin, and I got a full ride at Wisconsin, and that was where I ended up going. And so I got a degree in science journalism at Wisconsin, was hired by McClatchy newspapers in California, was the first environment writer at the Fresno paper, and then the first science writer at the Sacramento paper. So now I'm inventing it as I go. Literally, people have no idea what to do with a science writer. They've never had one. They've never even seen the Sacramento Bee's specialty is sports and politics. People couldn't even figure out how to give me an assignment. I mean, this is an amazing opportunity, right? When you're in this situation where no one even thinks you're of worth to where you are, the ability to invent it where you are. So I literally invented science writing at the Sacramento Bee. And I did what you get to do as a science writer, write about everything that interested me. And newspaper science writing is a wonderful thing. So the last 2 major projects I did an investigation of nuclear weapons design and deception by the Department of Energy, which actually got a particular program shut down by the General Accounting Office. And then I did a series on ethical issues in primate research, which won the Pulitzer-prize in 1992. And that was a study in stubbornness, frankly, getting that done. I used to tell people when I was working on it I would win the Pulitzer for aggravation, because it was so hard to get anyone to tell me anything. And that became my first book. And then I got a second book contract, and then the University of Wisconsin hired me back as a professor of practice, which leads me back to being a theoretical chemist. So I did all the job interviews, and I interviewed last with the dean of the College of Letters and Sciences at UW-Madison. And he said, why did you become a science writer? I said, well, and I tell him the story, the hair on fire, right down to, my whole rejection at 18 of theoretical chemistry. And he said, you can see this coming. I'm a theoretical chemist, after I've just said that no one would do that because it's the most boring profession in the world. And so what do you do, and speaking of failures, what do you do in that kind of situation when you're applying for a job and you tell the person who makes the ultimate decision that his profession is boring? I started laughing. I just completely burst out laughing. It was the perfect response in that situation. I'm not saying it would have been for everyone, but this guy then started laughing. Everyone else in the room was looking at us, howling. It was the most ridiculous situation. And so for years later, he would call me out. He actually wrote letters to the newspaper about me and how wonderful I was, I think he just loved that I'd had a sense of humor about the whole thing and that I wasn't afraid. And so now I have been a failed chemistry major, I've been a police reporter, I've been a science writer, I'm a university professor with an endowed chair with a master's degree. My father, again, was astonished by that. I had a full professorship with an endowed chair at the University of Wisconsin. And so I've reinvented myself again, right? Who am I at this point? And then I finally said to myself, and now I want to go back to chemistry. So I still think of chemistry what I thought of it when I was 18 years old, that it's beautiful, that it's the most fascinatingly intricate, fundamental explanation of how things work, and that it's occasionally sinister. And so that was all in my mind when I sold a book called Poisoner's Handbook, which looks at the invention of forensic toxicology in the United States and follows a couple of very pioneering scientists as they try to figure out how to catch poisoners in 1920s New York. And that book ended up being a New York Times bestseller and was a PBS documentary and led to the book I just published last month, which is about another chemist, America's first great food safety chemist and the invention of food safety in the United States. So you see, I follow this complete arc, right? I kept chemistry in there. I kept love of journalism in there. I've put all of them together. I've reinvented myself as a book author. And the final thing, and this is going to lead me to my, I think my point, I hope my point, is that when I came here to MIT, I'm director of the Night Science Journalism program at MIT. That is not a position that is a professorship with an endowment. That's a staff position, right? And so when I left Wisconsin and walked away from an endowed chair to be a staff, which is a different thing at a university, as you know, a lot of my friends thought I was crazy. And I thought, I can see people nodding, you're crazy. And I thought two things. One is I had complete confidence in myself that it didn't matter if I was tenured or not, that I could make this work. And in the years that I've been here, I've founded a magazine. I've launched a program to train science editors. I am just launching a program. We got just this month, it's small by science standards, but we got about almost $500,000 in grants from 2 different foundations to run these training programs, right? So I want to tell you a couple of things that I've learned. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I've reinvented myself constantly, and when you do that, I'm going to be someone else. I'm going to take this chance on myself. You learn to be your own cheerleader. You learn to just have enough faith in yourself that when you step off that cliff edge and you're, hanging in the air, you believe that you're going to make the landing. And that kind of faith in yourself that you only learn from mistakes and from taking chances on yourself and from reinventing yourself when things send you in a different direction will give you the confidence to do all kinds of exciting things. And I really believe that. And I see it in myself. I don't think I'm perfect at this, but I know that a lot of the things that I've done, the guy who edits the magazine we publish, he came to us from the New York Times, and he said the reason he signed on with me was that I was willing to roll the dice. And I remain, even at this stage of my career, I like to roll the dice and take a chance on things because I believe something interesting will come out of that. And I've learned from doing that by walking away from things, by making mistakes, by setting my hair on fire, right? All of those things have led me to here. And to the point that I want to say to you in the decisions I make now, and this is why I took the job here, life is short. Make a difference. If you don't make a difference, right, what's the point? Thank you.